Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong, and today we have a marvelous book for you. But before I get there, I want to thank our underwriter, audiobooks.com, for underwriting the program. And to remind you again that if you want to hear the interview again, you can always go to Good Books Radio on YouTube, and you can hear it as a podcast, or same thing on Facebook, Good Books Radio. You can listen to this to your heart's content. Our book today is Clementine, The Life of Mrs. Winston Churchill by Sonia Purnell. Now, I've always had a great interest in Churchill. I think he's one of the top 10 greatest men in the history of civilization, for that matter. And so I was excited to read about this because, the old saying that behind every great man is a great woman, and in this case it is absolutely true. So, Sonia, how are you today?
I'm very well indeed. It's great to be talking to you.
Well, I'm delighted to have you. I've enjoyed your book enormously. And I want to begin with your background. How did you develop an interest in Clementine?
Well, I was always very vaguely aware that he'd been married, but, I knew so little about his wife.
Uh-huh.
And I stumbled across a letter that she sent him in 1940, just after he'd become Prime Minister. And this letter really sparked my curiosity. It's affectionate, but it's really forthright. And she tells him that someone's been to see her, that they're worried about the way that he's behaving to his staff. And cast your mind back to what was going on at that point. I mean, Britain looked like it was about to be invaded. France was falling. The Benelux countries were all falling to Nazi Germany. It looked like Britain was going to be next. He'd just become Prime Minister, but people were scared of him, people around him working for him, and so they weren't producing their best ideas, producing their best work. So she wrote a letter to him. She tore up the first draft, and then she wrote it again, and it was taken by a servant down the corridor to his office. And it said to him, "You must make your staff love you. You are a very lovable person. Remember to be calm. Remember to be kind. Be kind and calm as you could ever be. Because that's how they will make you follow. That's how they will want to follow you. Mm-hmm. They won't be bound into submission, but they'll love you." And she was right, and he changed, and people did love him, and he became the leader that we all know about today, who didn't frighten people, but made them want to be part of what he was doing, and made them believe in themselves. And all the diaries and the accounts of people who worked for him at that time said, yeah, he changed. And so I wanted to know, who is this woman with such influence? And the more I dug, the more important, the more significant I realized that she was.
Something that I didn't realize when I was reading your book, and you brought this to light for me, was that she was quite a beautiful woman in her youth, particularly. I didn't realize, for some reason, I guess I just always seen pictures of her, when they're in their 50s and 60s, and in her matronly years, you might say. And in reading your book, when you get all these letters and all these diary entries from young men of the time, and she was, by today's standards, smoking hot.
She was. She had the most beautiful, dazzling sapphire eyes. These don't really come across in photographs, rather sort of frustratingly, but she was totally stunning. She was deemed to have the profile of a queen. People used to say that her face should have been on a coin. But certainly, she set many young men's hearts aflutter. And her little sister, Nellie, used to keep a file of marriage proposals under pending, rejected, impossible. There were simply so many. So, yeah, she was considered very, very hot. Absolutely.
And when she met Winston, did she fall for him right away?
No, the first time she met him at a ball and he was introduced to her, she was looking particularly beautiful that night. He could think of nothing to say, so he just stood staring at her. This great wordsmith was literally struck dumb by her beauty. Well, of course, she thought he was a bit strange and quite tried to get away as soon as possible. And 4 years later, they met again at a dinner party. Neither of them wanted to go. Both were a bit late, Winston Churchill, very late. There was one chair left at the dinner table. The others were already eating their main course of chicken, and Churchill arrived, sat down in this chair, and they didn't stop talking all night. They discovered they both loved politics and France and ideas and great events, and it was just wonderful. Suddenly there was this sort of great spark between them, and 4 months later they were married. It was that quick.
Wow, that was fast.
Yeah.
Especially considering she wasn't impressed the first time.
Absolutely, and she never thought he was handsome, by the way. It wasn't sort of that she thought he was a swashbuckling hero type. He was taller than him anyway. And by this point, he was in his early 30s, and he was gaining weight and losing hair. But he was mesmeric in his cleverness, his charm, his brilliance, his originality, and that's what really made it for her. Lots of handsome men have been chasing her. She'd broken off 3 engagements. This was totally different, though.
Well, when he was 23, I believe he was 23 when he published Savrola, which was a novel that he whipped out. And have you read that?
I have read that, yes.
And it kind of lays out a script for his life in a way.
Well, it does, and that's partly where the swashbuckling hero thing comes from. But I think that book actually also betrays his lack of understanding of women. And I think there's one line in it where it says, "Woman-like, she was asking 3 questions at once." And until he met Clementine, he really didn't, I'm afraid to say, have much respect for women as people to talk to. He thought they were beautiful. But Clementine was so clever and so interesting that his mind changed about women in general, but most particularly her. And you know what? Unlike an awful lot of other alpha males, world leaders, he was utterly faithful all through his marriage. He was devoted to her for 57 years. He never strayed. She was the one.
Now, one of the things that I did know before reading the book, but again, you fill out the details beautifully, is that people always say that if it weren't for Churchill's courting, so to speak, of FDR, that World War II may have worked out differently, that he really needed the Americans to come on board. And you point out that Clementine was really his secret weapon. She's the one who helped them to get along because they didn't really hit it off that well.
Oh, that's right. I mean, there were times when that relationship, obviously they were under intense strain, both of them, and there were cracks in that relationship fairly frequently. They had very different outlooks on life. Churchill was a great imperialist. Obviously, FDR wasn't. That was one of them. Churchill was worried about the Soviets long before Roosevelt came to sort of have concerns. There were other matters. Churchill was worried about how a lot of the military decisions after a while were being taken entirely by the Americans, and the Brits weren't really being included. So all of these things created tensions, as I'm sure you can imagine. It's at this point that the 2 women, so Clementine and Eleanor Roosevelt, her direct sort of counterparts, they had to paper over the cracks sometimes. They had to find ways to keep things going, everything calm and friendly and businesslike. And they did that. And they learned a lot from each other. I mean, that was a really interesting relationship that's never been explored before, and yet was also hugely important, absolutely.
Well, they were not always, Clementine and Winston weren't always on the same page politically either, right? She was for women's suffrage. She wanted the women to have the right to vote, and he wasn't terribly interested in that.
That's right. I mean, on many issues, you could argue that she was on to the left of Winston. In fact, her politics probably chimed more with Eleanor Roosevelt, another reason why they got on, than they did with her own husband in a way. But, over the years, she was very influential with him. She persuaded him finally to vote for female suffrage in 1918, or at least for some women then. So that was one victory for her. Another was his dealings in Ireland, where she persuaded him to be far more, in favour and pushing for the Irish Free State, which was the pre-run of the Republic of Ireland. Again, that was quite a major turnaround. And again, that came directly from her arguing the case with him, talking to him, and over time persuading him. I mean, those are just 2 examples, but there are many, many others where she was hugely influential. I mean, she was undoubtedly his greatest influence and his greatest advisor.
They were kind of unusual in the way that they lived. They were married, but they didn't live together in the way that we think of people living together, right?
Well, that's true. And I think, we have to sort of think about what life was like for Clementine. Being married to Winston Churchill was like being married to a hurricane. I mean, there was nothing ever stayed still for a second. It was a vortex of energy. It was exhausting to be with him for any period of time, believe me. She, for her own self-preservation, sometimes had to get away. She had her own bedroom right from the end of their honeymoon. That was always the case in all their houses. They went on vacations separately, partly because they had different tastes. His were rather more luxurious than hers, but also, again, she just needed to get away to kind of, regroup and then go back and, be the sort of strong person by his side again. Of course, she didn't do that during the war. She was around all the time during the war. But between the wars, sometimes she really literally had to get away to calm down, to, recover somewhat.
Right. Another thing that came up is kind of veering off subject, but it's just something I found delightful, was the kind of euphemistic age they lived in, where things were expressed in euphemism, really. Like one of the things you bring up is depression was talked about as the black dog, and staring at cleavage was peering down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yes, I think there was Pennsylvania Avenue, but yes, it was. But they were both born into the Victorian Age, where all sorts of things had euphemisms, and they were very much of that time. In many ways, their views went back to Victorian Age rather than 20th century. But, they were very open-minded when they had to be, and that included during the war, when they realized that certain strategic alliances between their daughter-in-law and American generals and journalists and key advisors to FDR, that was absolutely vital to keep that Anglo-American alliance going.
Is Downton Abbey a useful example of life in their time?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, Downton Abbey was the sort of life that Churchill wanted. He was born in Blenheim Palace. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's the only private palace in England. It is extraordinary. It is huge. It is incredibly grand. That's where he was born. But he was the son of the youngest son, so he never really inherited much money. He just wanted to have a life like that, like Downton Abbey. He wanted to have 20 full-time staff looking after everything. A lot of the time he pulled it off, but a lot of the time they were very close to bankruptcy as a result. So sometimes those staff would be laid off and dust sheets would be put over the furniture, and then some more money would come in, and then they would go on living like that again. But he was hugely extravagant. And this caused her great, great anxiety, I have to say.
Because she didn't grow up that way, right?
She didn't grow up that way at all, no. Although she was an aristocrat, her grandfather was a Scottish earl, her mother was Lady Blanche, but Lady Blanche had no money, she was divorced, and she was also rather taken with gambling, which is not a good thing in this case, and she didn't have any money. And I'm afraid to say, that sometimes there was no food on the table for supper. Sometimes Lady Blanche would forget. Sometimes she'd be away with her boyfriends, or she would have spent all her money on gambling. And Clementine would sometimes have to go to the markets or to the store and ask for credit to buy food. Well, that's the kind of thing that you don't forget, and it's the kind of thing that comes back to haunt you. And it did for the rest of her life. She was always worried about money. But again, living with Winston Churchill, that was, that wasn't easy.
Well, both of their mothers were kind of party girls, right?
Oh, yeah. Party girls, that's a good word for it. Yes, they were, they had many boyfriends. Lady Blanche, Clementine's mother, supposed to have had 10 lovers on the go at once at certain times in her life. So she was pretty busy, and Winston's mother had many, many lovers too, including supposedly the odd king. So, yeah, so it's even more interesting that their marriage was so rock solid, because their mothers certainly hadn't had that.
But you make the point that Winston's mother didn't really pay attention to him until he got famous, and then she cared.
Yeah. That's so right. I mean, both of them had emotionally deprived childhoods. Jenny, who was Winston's mother, born in New York, an heiress, had gone over to marry a British aristocrat, but she really wasn't interested in Winston until he became famous. And then she was quite a doting, attentive mother, but as a child, he was really neglected. He went off to boarding school and his parents never visited, and you see these really pleading letters from him. Darling mummy, I long to see you. And he was 14 by then.
That was so sad.
It is very sad, very sad. And so Clementine was this great rock in his life and gave him the security that he'd never had as a child. And I think, again, she was seeking comfort and security from him as well. They'd found kindred spirits in each other.
One of the things a lot of people know about Winston is that that he was uniquely responsible for saving Western civilization from Hitler. And he did it primarily through language. I don't know who said it, but there's some great quote that Winston armed the English language and sent it into battle.
Yeah.
And I know that Clementine was his first editor for many of his speeches.
Yes, absolutely. She, I think partly because of her own upbringing, she felt very strongly the speeches should not have words in them, that someone who's only had a very sort of basic education would have to look up in the dictionary. So they should be simple words. And if you think about those speeches, they are simple words. They're all the more effective for it. So she was very keen on that, and she would edit the speeches, and she would put little passages in and take little passages out, and then he would rehearse them with her. He was always very, you might not think this, but he was quite nervous about public speaking, and he would try and get things absolutely nailed down so that there was no room for things going wrong. He really was quite worried about speaking in public, and it's extraordinary to think that now. And at the end of his speech, he would often turn to her and sort of just whisper, "Was that all right?"
It was interesting that two of the greatest speakers in Western civilization, Demosthenes and Churchill, both had lisps.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Maybe there's something in the psyche that makes you want to make your words even better as a result to overcome that. I don't know, but it's extraordinary.
I like that point that you make about the simplicity of the words because, we will fight on the beaches and blood, toil, tears, and sweat, very simple but strong words. And allowed the people to, rally behind him. One of the things I've never understood, and maybe as a person of deep British knowledge, maybe you can explain this to me. Why in the world would Churchill lose an election after he had saved Britain from Hitler?
Well, it's complicated, but the brief version is that people associated him with fighting. They didn't associate him with hope for after the war. During the 30s, Britain had been a very class-divided country. You had the haves, you had the have-nots. They very rarely came across each other. He was from the Conservative Party, which had been widely blamed by people for that big division in society. And so, although they loved the man, they didn't like his party, and they were disappointed that he seemed to be unable to look ahead to peace and to create a better world, a better country for them. And Clementine was always urging him, talk more about after the war, talk more about hope and improvements and how it will be better. But he was so tied up, so exhausted by the war itself that I think he failed to do that. And I think it was the Labour Party just presented a rosier picture of what was to come once the fighting had stopped. And I think people wanted houses, they wanted schools, they wanted hospitals, and that's what they were promised, but not by Churchill. It was the most extraordinary rejection, and it seems bizarre looking back, but that's how people felt, and they felt it very strongly.
Well, that's the best explanation that I've ever heard, so I
thank
you for that. The other thing I found interesting about Churchill, although I didn't learn it from your book here, but the fact that he was supportive of, I guess what you call universal health care when he was, young.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, this is a really interesting fact about Churchill that many people have forgotten. But with Lloyd George, back into 1910, 1911, he helped to lay the foundations of the British welfare state, and not just health, which didn't come in actually until after the Second World War, but things like pensions and unemployment exchanges. So if you lost your job, you could go somewhere and they would help you find another one. Many other sort of benefits, really. The origins of those were set up by Churchill, very much with Clementine encouraging him, I have to say, because this is something that she felt very, very strongly about, and was the time when they were probably most in tune politically. So, yes, people forget that he helped to create the welfare state. I'm sure he wouldn't have ever imagined it would become what it has become now. But he also, the other thing that he did was he was very much a pan-European. He didn't call it the European
All right.
Union.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
After the war, for all European countries to sort of, club together and never go to war again. So again, he sort of had this incredible vision of what was going to happen later on.
So he was in some ways liberal, and in some ways very conservative. He would be, in American standards, he'd be sometimes Democrat, sometimes Republican.
Yes, I think that's fair. That's absolutely fair to say, yeah.
And now, tell us about how things are in their marriage later in life, because that's where I always think of a really beautiful older marriage between these two.
Yes, well, I mean, after the war, once they'd got over the terrible shock of being rejected, I mean, even though she thought it was coming, it still hurt when it did. They sort of settled down to what they liked doing best. He liked painting and talking to other politicians and going on vacation, and she picked up a little bit with her friends as well. She didn't want him to become Prime Minister again. She thought he was too old and too ill. He did, and she was very upset about that. And of course he then had a stroke which rather proved her right. And then when he finally retired after that, life was quieter. He didn't like it being quiet. He very bitterly, felt nostalgic for his old days being in the seat of power, and she had to cheer him up and keep him going. But people around saw it was only Clementine who was really capable of doing that, and so he relied on her ever more as he got older. And
then he wrote all of his great books at that time, the war years, and the marvelous collection about World War II, which became, I guess, the best-selling history books of the war, right? Yeah, and it has informed what other scholars have done ever since when they've been looking at the Second World War. I mean, I think he once joked, didn't he, that when someone said, "How will you go down in history, Mr. Churchill?" and he said something like, "Well, it depends who writes it." And then I think he thought he wanted to get his version in first. Yes, I think he did.
Yeah. And she totally supported him in doing that and got involved in editing the proofs with him. And he was a prodigious writer. I mean, he would churn books out by the dozen. I mean, really quite extraordinary.
Well, another thing about him that, two things, but let me get the first one first. There's a belief on the part of a lot of people that he flunked grammar school a couple of times, or it's hard for us in America to have an exact analogy to British school system, but that's kind of what you hear when you're a little kid. Well, Churchill flunked grammar school twice, and so there's hope for you. Right.
Well, it was actually a public school, or what you would call a private school. It's very confusing, but so he was at Harrow, and most of the time he did pretty badly there. There were one or two teachers who recognised he was an extraordinary boy, but it was only one or two. And then he applied for the Army College, Sandhurst, and he flunked that twice and had to have special tutors, and then finally got in. So yes, many parents in Britain, when consoling themselves about their sons and daughters who may not be doing too well at school, say, well, at least Winston Churchill made it in the end, and he sure did.
But it's astounding to think that would be possible, but I suppose that like a lot of us, he might have been wonderful in languages and writing, but not so strong in mathematics. I don't know.
Yep, you choose exactly the right subject. Math was anathema to him. He never liked sums, he never liked figures. He was hopeless with his own money, absolutely hopeless. And when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the late 1920s, so he was in charge of Britain's money, he wasn't all that good at that either. That was not the right job for him, money and everything. He was much better at the big picture.
One of the remarkable moments in the book for me is when he is, Lord of the Navy? I forget the title. What is the title?
Lord, yes. First Lord of the Admiralty, yeah.
What a great title, God.
Isn't it? You've got a great house and a great yacht.
And a ship, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Not a bad job, yeah.
But you point out that in World War I that he's planning all of the naval operations, and he's going down to kind of put his 2 cents in with the Army, right?
Yeah.
And his wife, this is the moment that struck me, and where his wife said, "You're only 39 years old. You need to realize these are older men, and they're not going to take kindly to you sticking your nose in." And somehow that just struck me. I said, 39 years old, and
Yes.
he's in charge of the entire Navy? Wow.
I know. I mean, but he had done so much by that point and was eager to do so much more. And in his eagerness, he didn't realize that he offended people. And he wasn't very empathetic in that way. He just didn't see it. And so she would have to say, well, hang on a minute, Winston, you know, I wouldn't go and interfere in army matters just now because actually you're in charge of the Navy, which is much more exciting and important anyway. And she would sort of manage him. And he would then sort of write to her and say, oh, how right you were, once he'd realised what he was doing. And so they might argue over it, but often he came round to her point of view and admitted as much.
So your argument would be that Winston would not have been as great a man had he not been, shall we say, properly managed by Clementine.
Okay, well, let's just think about his chief of staff in the Second World War. Let's just see what he says. General Pug Ismay, certainly no feminist, worked for Churchill all the way through the Second World War pretty much, up close, saw how the two worked together. His conclusion was, I just quote it to you,
Okay.
that without Clementine, the history of Winston Churchill and the history of the world would have been very different. Well, I guess he knew what he was talking about. He was right there, and that was pretty powerful when I read that.
It's about as strong a proof as you can get.
Yeah, I think so.
We have about 2 minutes left. Is there anything that you want to make sure people know about Clementine?
Well, I think it was just that she was an excellent politician in her own right, and she had this feeling for people outside those sort of high-ranking circles where they were. And one of the ways that she showed that, which I think was a little brilliant piece of political symbolism, is that if you look at pictures of her during the war, practically everyone, you'll see that she wore this sort of strange kind of turban on her head. They were often in beautiful materials, silks, you know, chiffons and things, but she was always wearing this thing. And you might ask yourself, well, why was she doing that? Well, the reason she did that was a lot of women who were working in the munitions factories, working with heavy machinery, dangerous chemicals, had to wear them to keep their hair out of danger. So this was her tribute to women who were making great sacrifices, doing dangerous, dirty, hard work. And it was her way of saying, I've not forgotten you. This war means that we're all in it together. It's nothing to do with class or gender or political outlook. It's a national thing. It's a unified thing. And I just think these little ways that she put these ideas across to people were hugely appreciated back then, but somehow have been lost since. So I guess my book, I'm just trying to do what Gil Wynant, the American ambassador, hoped that someone would do one day. He wrote in 1947, he said, I hope that one day, if the future breeds historians of understanding, someone somewhere will give Clementine Churchill her due. So that's what I'm trying to do.
I think you have. It's a beautiful, beautiful read. Well, we're out of time. Let me sign off here, but hang on, because I want to talk to you again a little bit if you have time.
Okay.
The book again is Clementine, The Life of Mrs. Winston Churchill by Sonia Purnell. A beautiful, beautiful read, highly endorsed by all of the usual publishing sources that praise books. And I don't have time to go into it now, but take my word for it. You want to get this book. Marvelous, marvelous, and beautiful read. So, signing off again, I'm Dr. W.F. Strong for Good Books Radio. Here's hoping that all your books are good reads.